Hello and welcome to the Gaggle. I'm Ciara Haley and I'm joined today by my co-founder and co-host, George Szamuely, and Anya Parampil, who is the host of Red Lines at the Grayzone, and currently she is in Bolivia. Anya, welcome to the Gaggle.
Thanks for inviting me, Samuel and Ciara.
I'm very happy to have you here.
I'm sorry. Thanks for inviting me, George and Ciara. My bad.
No problem. We're very happy to have you. And today we'd like to focus on these amazing election results that recently have been confirmed. We have the Social Party back in power almost a year after the right-wing coup, and we want to have some kind of an expert explanation for the stunning victory. So my first question to you, Anya, is can you explain this victory? Where has it come from? And what is the significance of Mas coming back into power?
Well, again, it's nice to be speaking with you, Ciara and George. The first point that's key to understand about this victory we witnessed on Sunday is that I've been here in Bolivia for a week, and I don't think anyone that I spoke with expected such a resounding mandate. There were a lot of questions and there were fear about what the coup government would do to diminish the vote or try and block the will of the Bolivian people. But the last numbers that I saw, with over 80% of the vote count in, have the MAS, or Movimiento al Socialismo party, led by Luis Arce, with at least 53% of the vote, and that number keeps growing as more votes come in. This is key because last year, the narrative which legitimized the right-wing military takeover in the country was based on mainly on a report put forward by the Organization of American States, which accused the MAS of voter fraud. That's because the candidate and previous president, Evo Morales, really only avoided a second vote by a small margin. And this time around, the MAS was able to secure over 8 and 10% more than it was last year in its vote. And so there was really no room for the international observers, which may have had other interests in this election, to call for fraud. And there was no way for the coup government to manipulate the vote, because I actually came here first in capacity as an electoral observer. And so on Sunday during the vote, I was able to visit around 6 or 7 polling stations here in La Paz and witness the voting process and witness the vote count, the initial vote count. And so what happens in Bolivia is initially there are polling stations set up all around the country. People wait in line. Once they arrive or are at the front of the line, they have an ID check. They're then directed to a Mesa, or a polling station within a larger precinct. And once they're there, their ID check is checked again. There's a very interesting process where the individual running the polling station holds up the blank ballot, shows that it's completely unmarked before that person goes into a private voting station, and then comes out and marks the list of voters with their thumb and signature after dropping their ballot in a voter box. So it's very secure in the actual way that voters choose their candidates. And then the actual counting process is very transparent as well. What happens is the individual mesas actually open the boxes, and in front of anyone who's present for all to see, individual citizens come to these precincts because they want to make sure their votes are counted. Journalists are present, electoral observers are present, and they simply hold up the ballot. You can see very, very clearly where it's marked, and then they mark it on a tally sheet behind the station. Those numbers are then sent on to the Electoral Council, which tallies them. But because of that transparency, which I certainly found to be more transparent than our voting process, mine in the United States, where some of you might remember that this year during the Democratic primary, the Iowa caucus was actually decided with a coin flip in some instances, and they tried to hide the results on this shadowy, questionable app.
Yeah.
That made it very difficult to manipulate the vote. And so for a while on the night of election night, there was silence. Exit polls weren't coming out, even though we expected them around 8 p.m. And so people were concerned that somehow the vote had been manipulated or was going to be hidden, that this was going to be a drawn out process. But then suddenly at midnight, all media, and I should say the media in this country is all aligned 100% with the coup government in the lead up to the election. I saw no Mas voices present on these stations, but by midnight they were all forced to announce that Luis Arce had over 50% of the vote. And what it means is that around 8%, 10% of the population which voted for Carlos Mesa, the opponent of Luis Arce this year, but around the 8%, 10% of those people who voted for him last year voted this time for the Mas because they've lived under the right-wing coup regime for this past year, and they realized that it was a mistake perhaps to move away from the Mas. And so that's why we see this huge victory, which cannot really be contested. Carlos Mesa dropping out on Monday, Luis Almagro from the OAS congratulating the Bolivian people, despite last year's report, which validated the coup. So we know that because voting is actually mandatory in Bolivia. You can assume that the same people who voted this year voted last year. And so it not only in that...
Isn't this year, I think there was almost 90% of the country voted?
Yeah, there's resounding voter participation because people actually, if you don't vote in Bolivia, you lose access to your bank account for 3 months. You might not be able to vote in the next election. You get scrubbed. So there are measures in place to encourage high-level voter participation, and because of that, as I mentioned, it means that the same people who voted last year are likely the ones who voted this year. And because it was a new candidate, because they saw what happened following the military takeover last year, the people here decided to deliver Mas an overwhelming victory.
Yeah, and Anya, you mentioned Carlos Mesa, the candidate for the right-wing side of things. And now he is not a new candidate. He actually has been in power previously. And could you just elaborate a bit on his record? Did his record contribute to the fact that people did not want or did not go towards voting for the right-wing side of things, even though not everyone is a fan of Morales, not everyone is a fan of Mas? Do you think that the fact that people are already acquainted with his regime and his rule affected the outcome on this vote?
Absolutely. That's the irony here, is that Carlos Mesa himself was the last president to rule Bolivia before Mas was born as a massive political force and won power in the country. He was actually vice president up until 2003 under a previously centrist neoliberal president known as Goni here, Gonzalez. And he oversaw a very contentious period in Bolivia when he natural gas. This led to a massive strike in the country. Working people, Goni had to, and that is when Mesa himself took over. And at that point, he instituted a typical neoliberal program, turning to the IMF for assistance to pay public salaries, and also attempting to privatize key resources in Bolivia, including the water supply. And this is what sparked a popular protest in the country, similar to what we witnessed this year when when social movements and working people went on strike and worked to shut the country down in order to demand their right to vote. That happened in 2005, 2004, as they built this popular movement. And eventually what happened is Mesa was forced to resign. There was one more interim president whose only duty was really to call for elections. Mm-hmm. And it was that election in 2005 that Evo Morales won in a resounding victory, and that led to the 14 most prosperous years in all of Bolivia's history, Bolivia being one of the poorest countries in this region. So it did say a lot that Carlos Mesa, this individual who really already had shown his true colors to the Bolivian people, was the candidate that they could put forward. And they put him forward last year as well. And it's no surprise when you know that history, and especially the history of the last year after the coup, that the Bolivian people rejected Carlos Mesa.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much in the living memory of most.
Could I ask Anya? So what happens now? I mean, what do you think will be the program of the new government, and how realistic are its prospects of being able to implement such a program?
Well, the difficult part has certainly just begun. What happens now? That's the question. And first, what happens is we have to actually make sure that this transition of power takes place. It could happen, according to the electoral tribunal here, as early as the end of the month, the very beginning of November. It could be sometime around November 15th. But the government, the coup government, de facto government, which has ruled Bolivia since the military takeover last year, as well as the military and police, are responsible for overseeing that transition. Though at this point, they've conceded power and have acknowledged the results. So people I was expecting more of a presence of the MAS in the streets at this moment. I think partially because of COVID, the pandemic, that's made it difficult for people to go out here. But I also think that they want to kind of keep a low profile and just make sure that they don't rock the boat too much before this transition actually takes place. After that point, it'll be difficult. The task ahead for the new government is really monumental. As you can imagine, similarly to everywhere around the world during this coronavirus outbreak, the economy of Bolivia has suffered massively because of the informal economy, people not being able to work due to the lockdown implemented. But even before then, there was a very massive economic crisis in the country due to the fact that the coup government just didn't prioritize investing in and sustaining the state economy, which had been developed over the previous 14 years. In fact, right now there's an airport worker strike in the country because airport workers haven't been paid for the past 3 months. The coup government doesn't really have an incentive to do so, but I did an interview with a local journalist here, Ali Vargas, who was explaining to me the process that the government has taken in terms of re-privatizing many industries and not paying workers, leading to unemployment rate of now over 33%. So the first issue that the MAS will have to tackle is the economy. And considering Arce is the former economic minister of Morales, he's well poised to take on that task. But another major expectation of voters here in the country is that the new government will work to implement some sort of truth and reconciliation and hold the military and police force accountable for the massacres and repression which took place over the past year. And that's difficult because at the same time, the government here, the new government, will have to be facing the fact that the military and police force responsible for the coup hasn't really changed. So it's a difficult balance, not confronting them to the point that actually challenge the power of MAS once again, but also making sure that the Bolivian people are satisfied and feel as though there's been justice brought for the people and the victims of this military coup regime.
And on top of that, just leading off that, Anya, do you think then also Janine Áñez will be held accountable for her role in the coup, and how decisive was her leadership?
Janine Áñez is interesting because she's certainly the face of the coup. Time magazine, I think, featured her as a woman in power in the world. So a great picture of what kind of a hyper focus on identity politics can actually mean. You get a woman, but you get a very right-wing coup government behind her. But really, that's the only purpose she served, was the face. And in my time in Bolivia leading up to the elections, we hardly saw her on national television. The individual that's really driving the show, that's really overseeing the day-to-day operations of the coup government, is a man named Arturo Murillo, who serves as the interior minister, effectively known as the government minister here in Bolivia. And he is a wealthy businessman who came into power alongside Áñez. He's the one who people here see as overseeing the police and military operations. He's been accused of perhaps ordering some of the massacres against indigenous people who were protesting last year following the military coup, demanding the democracy return to the country. And he also, I can just talk from personal experience, he led a campaign of intimidation against electoral observers as we arrived in the country. It was quite stunning that my team at the Grayzone, Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton, we came here as part of a delegation led by Code Pink, a U.S. organization, which was officially invited by the Supreme Electoral Council. We had letters stamped showing that we were invited. We had visas. Yet before we'd even arrived in Bolivia, while we were at a layover in Chile, our pictures were taken and photographed and posted online. We're not sure who exactly was responsible for that, but it looked like someone who was on our plane, because they took a picture of then Max putting his suitcase on the overhead carry-on section of the plane. So once these images circulated online, I thought, okay, maybe it's just a few crazy individuals who are right-wing from the country. I'm used to that because we've dealt with Venezuela.
They circulated as a warning to people, was it?
Yeah, once the photographs were online, people started calling Max a terrorist and saying that we were there to foment instability in Bolivia, that we were just there to support the MAS and overthrow the government. But I at first, as I was thinking that it was just a few crazy individuals online, something we're used to because I'm used to dealing with the Venezuelans in this regard. It actually went all the way up to Arturo Murillo, the interior minister, who ended up posting on Twitter, "We know where you are, and if you don't follow the rules, you can be arrested or deported." Their head of migration, a man named Marcel Rivas, also claimed that we were friends of Maduro who had come in to destabilize Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who'd come in to stabilize the country. And he went so far as to release the photos, the actual photos. When you enter a country, everyone knows you stop at migration, get your picture taken. Well, somehow the photos that were taken at the migration at the border of several Spanish delegates who were also invited and came here to observe the election were leaked online to a right-wing paper, as were their actual entry sheets that they filled out. Same thing happened to some Argentine delegates who came. But this means that the government was actually taking information, photographs, and data that was stored within the official migration services and leaking it to as part of a way to intimidate electoral observers. Those Argentines were arrested, held for quite a few hours. So that gives you an idea of just how insanely reactionary and right-wing this government truly was.
But I'm just asking about that. What happens now? Because presumably there is a serious deep state problem in Bolivia. To what extent will the military security apparatus cooperate with this government, or will they try to sabotage it?
Judging from the conversations I've had with people here, that will be the most difficult aspect of, I think, the MAS leadership, because while there might be a rank and file solidarity with MAS among the average soldier in the military, the hierarchy is still very firmly in place. These are individuals that were trained by the United States. They really, I mean, that's the core issue that I think was the lesson from last year's military coup, that even after 14 years of very popular leadership by Evo Morales, he was unable to penetrate the military. This is really the most dangerous force which exists in the country. And I think unless individuals such as Murillo, Anya is obviously because she was the face of the government, but the characters that we don't hear as much that were active behind the scenes, if they're not held accountable, then it certainly leaves the door open to mischief on behalf of the deep state, as you describe it, George. I think that's a good way of putting it. And that's always, I think, in countries such as this, where you're trying to implement massive change, the most difficult force to confront.
Yeah. And George, to both yourself and Anya, to contextualize this movement and the socialist victory in a wider context of Latin America, there's been suggestions that there's going to be a new pink tide of progressive governments like we saw in the 2000s. We have later on in the year elections coming up in Ecuador and in Chile as well. Do you think that there's hope in Bolivia's example, and that the right-wing governments that have been coming into power can be turned back?
I do think there's hope. I have never been to Ecuador or Chile, but at least with sources that I have in Ecuador, there's a very strong confidence there that the Correísta left-wing force can return to power next year in elections in Ecuador. We already had Argentina, Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Kirchner reemerge in Argentina. And so there is this trend. It's a rejection of U.S. foreign policy in the region, and certainly Trump administration policy. Not that I think a Biden administration will be much different on Latin America. The only dynamic that I will be watching and interested in seeing how it develops is how successful the U.S. policy to isolate Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua as sort of the solidly left-wing socialist countries that have very difficult to undermine and overthrow in some cases for decades. That's if you remember what John Bolton, the former Trump national security advisor, labeled as the troika of tyranny. Those are the countries which face incredibly difficult sanctions and economic war, really, on behalf of the United States. And I think there has been an effort on behalf of the U.S. to drive a wedge between some of the more progressive governments, such as Argentina, Mexico, now Bolivia, perhaps Ecuador, between those governments and the solidly left-wing forces in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And so they can threaten economic war against Bolivia if they align too heavily with the so-called troika of tyranny. But at the same time, there is a history of these countries all working together. It makes more sense for them to be working in an economic bloc and adding life to the region. So that's what I'll keep an eye out on for. But I really do think that there's a trend in the region. The trend is towards rejecting U.S. hegemony and empire and returning power to the hands of the people. And that's especially what voters did in Bolivia and what I believe they will do in Ecuador after they were forced to live under neoliberal or right-wing coup regimes, and in Ecuador's case, just under a complete traitor, someone who just gave up on the project he'd run on and on the mission he'd worked for previously and sold out to the IMF and United States.
So could I just ask them, do you think then that the Trump administration, or maybe even the Biden administration, they would take this very sophisticated approach of being friendly toward Bolivia in order to isolate Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua? I mean, are they really capable of such sophistication?
It depends on the administration. I think some of the higher ups in the Trump administration have been less sophisticated when it comes to Latin America policy. That's why we've seen such ham-fisted actions, such as the recognition of Juan Guaido, which I think hurt U.S. interests in Venezuela. When actually, wasn't it the former Obama National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, who actually tweeted the other day? He said these Trump administration officials with Marco Rubio are really responsible for conducting an incompetent imperialism. I was shocked that he used the word imperialism, but what he was saying there is we, as the Democrats, if Biden could come in and take power, we would do a better job at these countries against each other and
imperialism.
Yeah, exactly. So I found that comment interesting, and I think it applies to your question because the Trump administration might not be so adept at such a policy, but I do think there are people in and around the potential Biden administration who would have a better idea of how to approach the region and get actual results from U.S. policy. And already, honestly, the comments coming from the State Department regarding the victory in Bolivia surprised me, even though I'm not sure what more they could say after such a resounding victory. They are saying congratulations. This is essentially a mandate for the MAS, and we look forward to working with you. But it might not be a sophisticated policy, but all they have to do is threaten sanctions, but light a fire of economic aggression and threats that can really strangle countries such as Bolivia, and I think tie the hands of the leadership if they decide that they don't want to take a hard line on integrating with the more solid left-wing forces of the region. It's possible, but
I was just thinking about the sanctions. I mean, I'm not sure exactly the scope of the sanctions against Venezuela, but presumably that's a road that America could go down on, sanction Bolivia for its economic relationship with Venezuela.
Absolutely. That is the number one tool in the U.S. toolkit at the moment. It doesn't utilize diplomacy. It just throws things, and it's been a steady increase since the Obama years, really, when I think more traditional forms of military war became less popular in the United States. The U.S. leaned more forcefully on sanctions as a weapon, but Trump really put that into overdrive, as we've seen with Iran, Venezuela. And so I think that's really what the United States uses in order to get what it wants. I'm not sure what it would do to the Bolivia case, but it's certainly a fragile situation here with the economy, and it depends really on the next administration. I think the Trump administration is with sanctions in a way because it's incompetent empire, as Ben Rhodes said. There have been critics from within the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is what manages sanctions in the United States, saying that the Trump administration's overwhelming reliance on sanctions have actually damaged U.S. interests, because now our allies in Europe are starting to think, why do we want to be so dependent on the U.S. dominance of the financial system if it means we can't do businesses with countries such as Iran? And so I think it's been a clumsy policy. It will backfire ultimately if the United States were to use sanctions in an even more aggressive way. But the Trump, second Trump administration, I think would rely on these measures more. And a Biden administration, they are certainly not afraid of using sanctions, as we saw under Obama, the maximum pressure campaigns on Iran and North Korea in order to get them to the negotiating table. But they still do leave out more of a window open for direct conversation and diplomatic negotiation.
Yeah. Well, Anya, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that Arce can unify the country after what's been a very, very tough year for Bolivia. And thank you again. I wish you all the best in the rest of your time in Bolivia and covering what happens next. And thank you all for listening to The Gaggle, where we'll continue to challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, George. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. And we'll see you again very soon.
Thank you, Anya.
Thanks, George. Thanks, Ciara.